You are about to be witness to Victorian criminals from the past, many of them mere children, brought before a police court. Regular viewers of my channel will know that I like to present you content that reflects the lives of everyday people from days gone by, including more videos like this. Today, you will learn about convicted criminals in Newcastle, England, photographed between 1871 and 1873. Sentenced to incarceration or hard labour as punishment in Newcastle City Jail. Thanks to police identification records and a description of their charges, we can understand the difficult lives that led to wrongdoing. What's more remarkable about these accounts is that the photographs of the accused provide a connection to the nefarious activities described in a way more difficult to convey by text alone. You will discover some very unusual law-breaking carried out by some thought-provoking characters with very different jobs from those familiar to us today. Let me know in the comment section what, if any, sentences you find unfair, and if you think the lives and backgrounds of these people make the punishments given them all the more cruel. Make sure you watch to the end to reveal some really strange crimes. These are the criminal faces from the past. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. Margaret Kosh, 15 years of age and 4 feet 9 inches tall. Margaret Kosh of Newcastle, no occupation, was convicted of stealing a coat and, with no previous convictions, was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment with hard labour. Richard Bradshaw, 40 years of age and 5 feet 6 inches and a half tall. Richard Bradshaw, from Ireland, a hawker by trade, a street vendor or peddler of portable goods, was caught stealing money and sentenced to 6 months in jail in 1872. Ezekiel Yates, 35 years of age and 5 feet 5 1/4 inches tall. Ezekiel Yates, of Penrith, a grocer by occupation, was convicted of stealing tobacco and sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 6 months at Newcastle City Jail. Phyllis Robinson, 34 years of age and 5 feet 2 1/2 inches tall. Phyllis Robinson, a single woman of Alnwick, was charged with stealing money from a person and sentenced to 1 month custody at Newcastle City Jail. Unusually smartly dressed, perhaps dressed in furs, compared to other women here, Robinson may have been working as a prostitute. In 1873 it is reported that, in company with another woman, she approached a gentleman in Clayton Street, Newcastle, and asked him to stand them a glass of ale. He did so, and also bought them a pie. In return, he was robbed of £14. She had 15 previous court appearances, including vagrancy, drunkenness, and theft. Robert Hardy, 21 years of age and 5 feet 6 inches and a half tall. Robert Hardy, of Corbridge, a rail signalman by occupation, was convicted of stealing ale in 1873, along with George Ray and Thomas Pearson. He was sentenced to 4 months at Newcastle City Jail. George Ray, 30 years of age and 5 feet 6 inches tall. George Ray, from Scotland, a railway guard by occupation, was convicted of stealing ale in 1873, along with Robert Hardy and Thomas Pearson. He was handed a 6-month sentence at Newcastle City Jail. Thomas Pearson, 31 years of age and 5 feet 8 inches tall. Thomas Pearson, of Humsov, a railway guard by occupation, was convicted of stealing ale, along with accomplices Robert Hardy and George Ray, and sentenced to 4 months at Newcastle City Jail. Anne Kirk, 35 years of age and 5 feet 1 1/2 inches tall. Anne Kirk, from Ireland, who worked as a charwoman, a cleaner employed on a casual basis, was caught thieving money on several occasions and was finally sentenced to a stay of 3 months in Newcastle City Jail in 1873. James Scullion, 13 years of age and 4 feet 2 inches tall. James Scullion, of Newcastle, who worked as a labourer, was found guilty of stealing clothes and sentenced to 14 days hard labour at Newcastle City Jail. On completion of his term, he was sent to Market Weighton Reformatory School for 3 years. Such institutions existed in the 19th century as centres of correction for children convicted of more serious crimes. Reform of behaviour was sought through strict rules, education and training, Poor discipline was punished, but regular, though basic, food and medical care was given, otherwise uncommon to the lives of its inmates. Controversially, even for the time, children still had to carry out a 2-week term in prison before their time in a reformatory school, even though one of the aims of such schools was to keep children away from the bad influences of older habitual offenders. John Richards, 25 years of age and 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. John Richards, of Plymouth, a hatter by profession, a milliner engaged in the design, manufacture or sale of hats, was convicted of stealing money from a person and sentenced to 4 months' imprisonment at Newcastle City Jail. Jane Carlyle, 29 years of age and 4 feet 10 inches tall. Jane Carlyle, of Cumberland, a hawker by occupation, was sentenced to 2 months at Newcastle City Jail, having been convicted of stealing bed linen. Richard Remington, 15 years of age and 4 feet 2.5 inches tall. Richard Remington, of Newcastle, no occupation, was convicted of stealing a pipe from a shop and was sentenced to 14 days' imprisonment with hard labour. He was spared jail when his parents agreed to pay a fine and costs. John Taylor, 26 years of age and 5 feet 9.25 inches tall. John Taylor, of Newcastle, a bricklayer by profession, was convicted of stealing a trowel and sentenced to 1 month in Newcastle City Jail, following which he was returned for a further month imprisonment. Alice Mulholland, 18 years of age and 5.25 inches tall. Alice Mulholland, of Newcastle, who worked as a hawker, was sentenced to 6 months at Newcastle City Jail for stealing some boots. John Bolton, 26 years of age and 5 feet 1.5 inches tall. John Bolton, of Newcastle, a shoemaker by profession, was convicted of stealing leather and, having previously served 9 months in jail for theft, on this occasion he was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment with hard labour. Sarah Cassidy, 27 years of age and 5 feet tall. Sarah Cassidy, of Newcastle, who worked as a prostitute, was convicted of stealing money and was sentenced to 2 months in jail with hard labour. Cassidy had already served 42 days in prison over the preceding 2 years, having been convicted 6 times for law-breaking. John Mullen, 18 years of age and 5 feet 5.25 inches tall. John Mullen, of Newcastle, a labourer by occupation, was convicted of stealing a watch. He was imprisoned for 4 months with hard labour. Mullen was no stranger to prison life, having served time on 9 separate occasions. Isabella Hindmarch, 16 years of age and 4 feet 5.5 inches tall. Isabella Hindmarch, of Gateshead, employed as a servant, was convicted of stealing money and, with no previous convictions, was sentenced to 1 month in jail with hard labour. John Park, 19 years of age and 5 feet 6.5 inches tall. John Park, from Scotland, a cartman and soldier by occupation with the 14th Brigade Royal Artillery, a driver of horse-drawn vehicles for transporting goods, was convicted of stealing a violin and, with no previous convictions, was sentenced to 1 month imprisonment with hard labour. Catherine Kane King, 23 years of age and 5 feet 11.5 inches tall. Catherine Kane King, of Liverpool, who worked as a prostitute, was convicted of stealing a pocket watch, having previously served 7 days in prison for drunken conduct. On this occasion, she was sent to prison for 3 months with hard labour. Charles Burns, 19 years of age and 5 feet 5 inches tall. Charles Burns, of Liverpool, a miner by occupation, was convicted for false pretences, obtaining money, goods or services of value from a person by giving false statements, knowing them to be untrue. Burns was sentenced to 3 months at Newcastle City Jail. Anne Garrett, 22 years of age and 5 feet 2.5 inches tall. Anne Garrett, of Newcastle, who worked as a prostitute, was convicted of stealing money and served 1 month in prison with hard labour. She had previously been imprisoned for 42 days, having been convicted of crime on 6 occasions. Edward Fenn, 15 years of age and 5 feet 1 inches tall. Edward Fenn, of Woolwich, employed as a bobbin winder, tends machines that transfer yarn, thread or twine from spools to bobbins in the textile industry, was convicted of wearing apparel, stealing clothes, on 31st of March 1873, and was punished with 1 month in prison with hard labour. Elizabeth Rule, 54 years of age and 5 feet 3 inches tall. Elizabeth Rule, also known by Elizabeth Smith and Elizabeth Brown, of Edinburgh, who worked as a charwoman, was convicted of stealing clothing and bed linen 5 times between 1867 and 1872, for which she was imprisoned for a total of 11 months and 14 days. Thomas Haig, 17 years of age and 5 feet 3 inches tall. Thomas Haig of Askern, Yorkshire, a sailor by occupation, was convicted of stealing a pocket watch and, having no previous convictions, was sentenced to 1 month in jail with hard labour. Stephen Monaghan, 14 years of age and 4 feet 6 inches tall. Stephen Monaghan, from Scotland, no occupation, was convicted of stealing money on 25th of July 1873 and sentenced to 10 days hard labour and 3 years in Market Weighton Reformatory. Jane Cartner, 22 years of age and 5 feet 1.5 inches tall. Jane Cartner of Newcastle, occupation unknown, stole a silver watch and was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment at Newcastle City Jail. John Bryan, 21 years of age and 5 feet 6 inches tall. John Bryan, a waterman by occupation, someone who transfers passengers by boat or works in navigation or mooring, was sentenced to 4 months at Newcastle City Jail in 1873, having been convicted of stealing lead. Harriet Davison, 39 years of age and 5 feet 3 inches tall. Harriet Davison, of Hull, a laundress by occupation, was convicted of stealing money on 27th of March 1873 and was sentenced to 2 months hard labour. John Scott, 29 years of age and 5 feet 5 inches and a half tall. John Scott of Newcastle, who worked as a labourer, was convicted of stealing lead and sentenced to 6 months in Newcastle City Jail in 1872. Catherine Flynn, 34 years of age and 5 feet 1 inches tall. Catherine Flynn, from Ireland, occupation unknown, was convicted for stealing money from a person and sentenced to 6 months at Newcastle City Jail. John Thomas, 20 years of age and 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. John Thomas, of Newcastle, a soldier and a plasterer by occupation, was convicted of stealing slippers and was sentenced to 6 months hard labour. Mary Patterson, 25 years of age and 5 feet 3 inches tall. Mary Patterson, of Newcastle, occupation unknown, was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment in 1873 for theft of poultry. John Grieveson, 21 years of age and 5 feet 4 inches tall. John Grieveson, of Newcastle, a clerk by occupation, was convicted for the crime of stealing pigeons and ordered to carry out 4 months at Newcastle City Jail. Mary Ann McCaffrey, 41 years of age and 5 feet 5 inches tall. Mary Ann McCaffrey, of Newcastle, who worked as a hawker, was convicted of stealing a gold watch from a person and sentenced to 4 months in Newcastle City Jail. James Richley, 30 years of age and 5 feet 7.5 inches tall. James Richley, of Preston, a warehouseman by occupation, was caught stealing trivets, metal stands used to support kettles. He was sentenced to 7 days hard labour at Newcastle City Jail. Joseph Robson, 32 years of age and 5 feet 7 inches tall. Joseph Robson, of Newcastle, a mason by profession, was convicted of stealing a bird cage on 24th of February 1873 and was handed a 6-month term in prison. He had 3 previous convictions from 1870 to 1871, including a 3-month sentence for stealing a gun. Samuel Sweet, 24 years of age and 5 feet 5 inches tall. Samuel Sweet, of Newcastle, a plumber by occupation, was convicted of stealing lead on 26th of December 1872 and was sentenced to 2 months hard labour as punishment. William Brankston, 43 years of age and 5 feet 6 inches tall. William Brankston of Alnwick, who worked as a labourer, was sentenced to 1 month imprisonment in Newcastle City Jail for stealing 4 rabbits. John Devine, 17 years of age and 5 feet 7 inches tall. John Devine, from Ireland, a carver and gilder by occupation, was imprisoned in Newcastle City Jail for 6 months after he was caught stealing money from a person. George Lee, 39 years of age and 5 feet 12 inches tall. George Lee, of Felling, and a traveller, was caught stealing money and sentenced to 3 months in Newcastle City Jail. Robert Cruddas, 25 years of age and 5 feet 10.5 inches tall. Robert Cruddas, of Barnard Castle, who worked as a labourer, was convicted for the crime of theft of money and was sentenced to 6 months at Newcastle City Jail. John Allen, 19 years old and 5 feet 8 inches tall. John Allen, of Wark, who worked as a labourer, stole some money and was sentenced to a term of 6 months at Newcastle City Jail. Thomas Dixon, 20 years of age and 5 feet 6 inches tall. Thomas Dixon, a fireman by occupation, was sentenced to 6 months at Newcastle City Jail for theft of money. John Story, 32 years of age and 5 feet 8 inches tall. John Story, of Newcastle, who worked as a labourer, was convicted for the crime of stealing wood and sentenced to 1 month at Newcastle City Jail.